They said it would be the battle to end all battles, that it would break the deadlock, that it would change everything. But when the smoke cleared and the guns fell silent, all that remained was mud, blood, and 1.5 million shattered lives. So what really happened at the Battle of the Somme, and why did it go so terribly wrong? The Battle of the Somme is one of the bloodiest and most tragic chapters in human history. It was supposed to be a turning point in World War I, a bold strike that would shatter German lines and bring a swift end to the war. Instead, it became a symbol of the senseless slaughter, miscalculation, and unimaginable suffering that defined the Great War. In this episode, we're going to walk through the Somme, from the build-up to the brutal first day to the grinding months that followed, and try to understand how such a catastrophe unfolded. This tale is not just about dates and numbers. It's about people, the young men who marched with hope and returned broken or not at all. It's about the letters they wrote, the ground they bled for, and the legacy they left behind. The First World War didn't begin with trenches. It began with a bullet. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb nationalist and member of the Black Hand secret society. The murder set off a diplomatic crisis. Austria-Hungary, with the backing of Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia accepted most demands, but rejected a few. On July 28th, Austria-Hungary declared war. Within days, the dominoes fell. Russia mobilized in defense of Serbia. Germany, seeing this as a threat, declared war on Russia and then on their allies France. Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium brought Britain into the war. What could have been a localized conflict spiraled into a global war due to a web of entangling alliances, aggressive military planning, and intense nationalism. Empires spanning continents were drawn into the abyss, including colonial soldiers from Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The political temperature had been rising for decades. Europe was a powder keg of imperial rivalry, militarization, and ethnic tension. Countries had been stockpiling weapons and cultivating a sense of invincibility. War, they believed, would be short and glorious. The Western Front had solidified. The war of movement had ended. A war of attrition had begun. Millions of young men joined up with patriotic fervor. Many even lied about their ages so they could enlist. But that fire would be tested and extinguished in the frozen mud of the trenches, beneath the shell fire of Verdun, and ultimately on the blood-soaked fields of the Somme. But the Schlieffen Plan, Germany's blueprint to quickly defeat France before turning east against Russia, failed. French and British resistance at the Battle of the Marne in September 1914 halted the German advance. Both sides dug in. To understand the Somme, we have to go back to the trenches of late 1915. The Western Front was stuck. British and French troops had been fighting tooth and nail against the Germans since 1914, and after a year and a half, almost nothing had changed. Thousands had died for scraps of land. Every assault led to huge losses. The deadlock was total. The Allies knew something had to give. Britain and France planned a massive offensive for mid-1916, originally meant to be a joint operation. But then, everything changed. In February 1916, the Germans launched a devastating attack on the French at Verdun. Suddenly, France was tied down, bleeding men every day. That left Britain to carry more of the burden. The Somme, which had been planned as a French-led assault, was now to be led by the British, who had never conducted an offensive on this scale. It would be their biggest test yet. But they weren't ready. Not really. British Commander General Douglas Haig believed in a massive push. His idea, unleash a week-long artillery barrage, to obliterate German trenches, wire, and machine gun nests. Once the barrage stopped, British troops would walk across no man's land, take the ruins, and push the Germans back. On paper, it made sense. The British had nearly 1.5 million shells. They'd pound the enemy day and night. The logic was simple. Nothing could survive that. But it wasn't that simple. Many of the shells were duds. The Germans were dug deep, in bunkers 30 feet below ground. The wire wasn't cut. The machine guns were intact, and the British, especially the newly formed volunteer armies, known as Kitchener's Army, were not trained for this kind of war. Still, Haig was confident. 0 hour was set for 7:30 a.m., July 1st, 1916. As the sun rose on July 1st, 1916, the air in the trenches was heavy with anticipation, nerves, and an overwhelming silence. After 7 days of deafening bombardment, over 1 million shells fired, the guns fell still. A deceptive calm returned to the battlefield. For many soldiers, this was the most terrifying moment. The eerie silence before the storm. Inside the British trenches, young men fixed bayonets, adjusted packs, checked their rifles. Many were barely older than 18. Some laughed nervously. Others sat quietly, staring into the earth, clutching Bibles or family photos. Officers moved among the ranks, offering words of encouragement that rang hollow even to their own ears. At 7:28 a.m., 2 mines, each packed with 40,000 pounds of explosives, detonated beneath German positions near La Boisselle and Hawthorne Ridge. The ground shook. A thunderclap ripped through the still air. Then came the signal. At 7:30 a.m., whistles blew up and down the line. 100,000 men climbed out of the trenches and began walking across no man's land. They moved as ordered in long lines at walking pace. High Command believed the artillery barrage had neutralized all German resistance. Soldiers were instructed to move forward steadily, not to run. For many, it was their first time in combat. But the barrage had failed. They expected broken Germans, stunned by the bombardment. Instead, they met hell. Many German machine gun nests had survived in deep dugouts. As the British infantry emerged from the mist and smoke, they were met with a wall of fire. German MG-08 machine guns opened up from hidden positions. Bullets scythed through the lines like a harvest.
Survivor, quote, Private Alfred Anderson. It was like the gates of hell opened. You could hear the bullets hissing like bees. Men were falling, but there was nowhere to hide. We just kept walking forward.
No man's land was a death trap. Craters from the week-long shelling made movement difficult. Barbed wire remained intact in many places, tangling men in the open as they tried to press on. The dead and wounded began to pile up within minutes. In places like Beaumont-Hamel, the Newfoundland Regiment was annihilated. Of the 801 men who went forward, only 68 answered roll call the next day. In the attack at Serre, entire waves of soldiers were gunned down within yards of their starting line.
Survivor quote, Lieutenant J.A. Ross, the whole earth seemed to shake. Our men were cut down like grass. I will never forget the screams, the torn bodies, the chaos. It was slaughter.
The soldiers who weren't killed outright often lay wounded for hours in the sun, unable to move or call for help. Snipers waited for any sign of movement. Those who tried to rescue comrades risked and often met the same fate. Commanders, many miles behind the lines, believed progress was being made. Messages sent back were often outdated or optimistic. Reinforcements were ordered forward into the same killing zones. The slaughter continued. As the day wore on, the true scale of the disaster became clear. Entire battalions ceased to exist. Units that had trained together, laughed together, marched together, were now names on casualty lists. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors of the first wave returned to trenches in shock. Some wept openly. Others were silent, their faces blank, covered in blood and mud, not all their own. By the end of July 1st, the British Army had suffered 57,470 casualties, including 19,240 dead. It was the single bloodiest day in British military history. And the worst part? The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The Somme offensive would grind on for another 140 days. But the first day, that terrible first day, remains etched in the soul of a nation.
Survivor, quote Captain W.P. Neville, "The men showed courage beyond belief, but courage was not enough. We were sent into a meat grinder."
Historians would later call the Somme a failure of planning, a failure of tactics, a failure of imagination. But for the men who went over the top that morning, it was something else entirely, a descent into a nightmare from which many never returned, and those who did were never the same. And yet, amid the horror, there was bravery. Men carried wounded friends back under fire. Messages were delivered across shell-torn ground. Lives were saved, even as others were lost. In the darkness of war, the light of humanity flickered still. That is the legacy of the Somme. Not just of strategy and loss, but of those who stood and fell and endured.
Survivor quote, Lance Corporal Fred Lunn. "We charged, we always charged, but it was like running into a meat grinder. The guns never stopped."
German machine gunners, hidden in concrete bunkers, opened fire. Men fell in waves. Entire units were mowed down in minutes. Some soldiers never made it 20 yards. In some places, the British did reach the German lines. But they were few and isolated. The rest, well, they were left behind. By the end of the day, the British had suffered 57,470 casualties. Almost 20,000 were dead. It was, and still is, the single worst day in British military history. And yet, the battle continued. After the first day, the plan changed, but only slightly. The British now tried smaller attacks, aimed at limited objectives. But the fighting was still brutal. They took villages like Mametz and Contalmaison. They lost others like High Wood and Delville Wood. Every gain came at an enormous cost. And the weather turned. Rain fell, turning the battlefield into a swamp. Bodies sank into the mud. The wounded drowned where they fell. Soldiers slept next to corpses. Shells fell day and night. The living envied the dead. In September, the British unleashed a new weapon, the tank. But it was too early. Most broke down. Others got stuck. The few that worked shocked the Germans, but it wasn't enough. The Germans fought hard. Their defenses were strong. They had depth, skill, and determination. The British, though brave, were bleeding out. Still, Haig pushed forward. By November, the weather was unbearable. Rain, snow, freezing wind, mud that could swallow a man whole. The final British assaults gained ground, but not much. And finally, on November 18th, the battle ended. 141 days. Over 1 million men wounded or killed. For what? The British gained about 6 miles of ground. 6 miles. It wasn't the breakthrough they'd hoped for. The Germans hadn't been crushed. The war wasn't over. Those who survived faced the misery of trench life. Mud, lice, rats, and the constant fear of artillery defined daily existence. Rain turned trenches into swamps. Gas attacks were a constant threat. Sleep was rare. Hygiene was worse.
You lived like an animal. You slept in your clothes. You ate when you could. But we looked after each other. We had to. That's what kept you sane.
And yet, camaraderie grew among the men. Jokes, songs, letters from home, these became lifelines. But something had changed. The Somme had opened people's eyes to the scale of the suffering, to the cost of pride, to the reality of industrial war. Behind the numbers were the men, sons, fathers, brothers, young volunteers from towns across Britain, cut down in minutes. Entire communities were devastated. In some cases, every man from a village died on the same day.
Survivor quote, Captain Robert Graves. We went in boys and came out old men. That was the Somme. It changed us all.
Families received telegrams one after another. Mothers collapsed. Wives waited for letters that never came. Letters from the front tell the truth. One soldier wrote,
"We are like sheep going to the slaughter.
Another,
The mud is worse than the shells. You can't imagine it. You can't breathe."
the trauma didn't end in 1916. Survivors carried it for life. Shell shock, lost limbs, nightmares. The Battle of the Somme wasn't just a military failure. It was a human tragedy on a scale that's hard to comprehend. The psychological trauma was immense. Men who returned were often shadows of who they'd been. Back then, they called it shell shock. Some thought it cowardice. Others thought it madness. But for those who suffered it, it was something far worse, the mind cracking under relentless horror. Symptoms varied. Tremors, nightmares, mutism, and uncontrollable weeping. Some men forgot who they were. Others screamed at nothing, flinched at every sound, or simply stared into space. Shell shock was poorly understood. Treatment was crude. Electric shocks, isolation, lectures on manliness. Some recovered, many never did. Today, we call it PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But back then, it was misunderstood, stigmatized, a hidden scar of the Somme, worn by thousands who returned home changed beyond recognition.
Survivor quote, Private Arthur Hubbard. I couldn't speak. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. They told me to be a man, but I left my soul in that trench.
The Somme shaped Britain's memory of the war. It became a symbol of bravery, of sacrifice, but also of futility, of poor leadership, of lives wasted. The Somme saw the clash of old tactics and new technologies. Cavalry charges met machine guns. Waves of men assaulted fortified positions. It was a deadly mismatch. Historians still debate Haig's role. Some say he had no choice, that the Somme wore down the Germans helped win the war. Others say he was blind to the suffering, stuck in old ways of thinking. German General Falkenhayn resigned. The Somme had strained the German army, but also hardened it. For the British, lessons were learned about coordination, tactics, and leadership. The Somme marked the emergence of a more modern British army. It wasn't victory, but it was transformation. Whatever the truth, one thing's certain. The men in the trenches paid the price. The toll of the Somme was staggering. Over 1 million men were killed or wounded. Families received telegrams, not sons. Streets in Britain bore the silence of mourning. In 1991, the legendary rock band Motorhead released a haunting ballad titled 1916. Unlike their usual hard-driving sound, this song was a somber tribute to the fallen of the First World War, especially the young soldiers who died at the Somme. Lemmy Kilmister's lyrics gave voice to a generation lost too soon. Over 3 decades later, in 2023, Swedish metal band Sabaton covered 1916 in a powerful music video that paid homage to those who never returned. Their rendition introduced the song and its story to a new generation, ensuring the memory of the Somme endures through music as well as history. The lead singer, songwriter, and bass player of Motorhead, Lemmy Kilmister, in an interview said,
19,000 Englishmen were killed before noon, a whole generation destroyed in 3 hours. Entire towns in northern Lancashire and South Yorkshire had a whole generation of men completely wiped out.
Survivor quote, Private John Dunn. We all came from the same street, the same school. By the end of the day, I was the only one left.
Today, the fields of the Somme are quiet, green, peaceful, but the ground hides stories of young men, of broken families, of a world that changed forever. The Battle of the Somme was not just a battle. It was a turning point in human history, not because of what it achieved, but because of what it revealed, the true cost of war. So when you see the poppy, or hear the silence at the 11th hour, remember them, not just for what they did, but for what it cost them. Thank you for watching. Please join us next time for more journeys through the world's past. And always remember, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it.